The first shot shattered the stillness of the hallway. At first, some thought it was a dropped book or a slammed locker. Then came the second crack, sharp and violent, echoing off the tiled walls like a thunderclap. Screams erupted. Doors slammed shut. The air filled with the frantic stampede of sneakers on polished floors. Elena Marquez, the psychology teacher, had been mid-sentence when the sound ripped through the school. For half a second, her brain rejected it. This was St. Augustine Catholic Academy, a place of hymns, whispered prayers, and the smell of chalk dust and incense. Violence did not belong here. But when the third shot rang out, closer, unmistakable, her instincts snapped awake. "Everyone, down," she hissed, heart hammering. She shoved desks toward the door, gesturing for her students to crawl into the far corner. Tiny bodies shuffled, eyes wide and tear-bright. Some whispered frantic prayers, others whimpered into their sleeves. Elena forced her voice steady. "Stay quiet. Don't move." Outside, the corridor fell eerily silent. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. He was talking to himself. The voice carried low but steady, a chilling cadence of rage and ritual. "They never listened, they laughed, but today they'll hear me." Elena pressed her palm against the cold floor, grounding herself, fighting the trembling in her chest. She recognized the voice. It was deeper now, angrier, but there was no mistaking it. Jonah Reeves. Her former student. Her stomach twisted. She remembered him at 15, quiet, bright-eyed, shy smile, a boy who sketched angels in the margins of his notebooks. Now, years later, his words were poisoned, distorted, brimming with something dark. Another shot thundered. A scream cut off abruptly. The footsteps drew closer, echoing past her classroom door. The handle rattled once, twice. Elena froze, her students holding their breath in unison. One girl clutched Elena's sleeve so tightly her nails dug into the fabric. From the other side of the door, Jonah's voice broke into a low, unsettling chuckle. "You can't hide forever. None of you can." And then silence. Elena's pulse roared in her ears. She knew the quiet was worse than the noise. Silence meant calculation. Silence meant Jonah was deciding where to go next. She looked at her students, terrified, fragile, waiting for her to be stronger than she felt. And for the first time in years, Elena prayed, not for herself, but that somehow she would have the courage to face the boy she once knew, and the monster he had become. 3 weeks before the chaos, Elena Marquez had already begun to feel it, the tension in the air, subtle but heavy, like the charged stillness before a storm. St. Augustine Catholic Academy was a small school, tucked away in a quiet Minneapolis neighborhood. Its old brick walls, stained glass windows, and crucifix-topped steeple had always felt safe to her, almost sacred. Yet lately, that sense of sanctuary has begun to erode. Elena arrived every morning at 7:15, carrying her leather satchel and a stainless steel coffee mug that never seemed to leave her hand. She would sit at her desk, stare at her notes for the day's psychology lesson, and feel the weight of an anxiety she couldn't quite name. Some days, it was the students. They seemed different, more restless, more distracted, more bruised by a world that pressed against them from their phones and the news. She taught them about resilience, about coping with anxiety, about how thoughts shape feelings and behaviors. But deep down, she wondered how much of her own advice she believed anymore. Because when she went home at night, Elena was not immune to silence. Her apartment, a small one-bedroom with peeling paint and a balcony overlooking a busy street, was filled with the kind of stillness that gnawed at the mind. She would sit with a glass of wine, listening to the faint hum of traffic, and the silence would feel alive, pressing against her, amplifying every doubt. Was she doing enough for her students? Was she really helping them? Was she even helping herself? She'd tried therapy once, years ago, after her mother's death. The grief had been crushing then, but therapy had felt like speaking into a void. Now, though, she sometimes thought about going back. Because the anxiety had teeth again, and it was biting deeper each night. It was during one of these evenings, as she graded papers under a yellow lamplight, that she came across a name that tugged at her memory: Jonah Reeves. He wasn't in her class anymore, he'd graduated 2 years prior. But his younger sister, Mary, was. Her essay was about the shadows of silence, a chilling reflection on loneliness, fear, and how silence sometimes felt louder than screams. Elena paused when she read the last line. My brother says silence is where the truth lives. But sometimes I think silence is where monsters grow. The words unsettled her. Mary was bright but withdrawn, a girl who rarely spoke unless prompted. The essay was eloquent but heavy, as though she was carrying someone else's darkness. Elena wrote a gentle comment in the margin, beautifully written, Mary. Would you like to talk more about this? But her mind was already circling something deeper. Jonah. She hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years, but she remembered him well. He was once quiet and brilliant, sketching angels and stained glass in his notebooks. But he also carried an edge, a simmering anger just below the surface, a shadow in his gaze when he thought no one was looking. She remembered faculty meetings where teachers muttered about him, isolated, brooding, too intense. And now here was Mary, writing about silence and monsters. That night, Elena dreamt of hallways. Endless school corridors, lockers stretching into infinity, footsteps echoing behind her though she was alone. In the dream, every door was locked, and she couldn't tell if she was running toward something or away. When she woke, drenched in sweat, the first thought in her mind was Jonah's name. The following morning, Elena stood at the front of her classroom with a piece of chalk in hand. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching on dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. The board behind her bore the day's topic, cognitive. This time, Mary Reeves' hand went up. Slowly. Hesitantly. Yes, Mary. Mary's voice was quiet but clear. It's when you imagine the worst possible outcome, even if it's not realistic. Like, your friend doesn't text back and you think they hate you. She paused, eyes downcast. Or, you hear a noise at night and assume someone's breaking in. A ripple of agreement moved through the class. Elena felt her throat tighten. Mary's examples were simple enough, but the tone in her voice carried a weight far older than her 16 years. Perfect answer, Elena said softly, forcing warmth into her tone. Catastrophizing is when fear tells us stories that may not be true. It's exhausting, isn't it? A few students nodded. Elena turned back to the board, but her eyes kept flicking toward Mary, who sat rigid, her pencil tapping against her desk in a nervous rhythm. Later, as students packed their bags, Elena noticed Mary lingering behind. She hesitated at the door, clutching her notebook to her chest as if debating whether to say something. For a moment, Elena thought she might. But then Mary lowered her gaze and slipped out with the others, silent as always. When the classroom was empty, Elena sat at her desk and let the silence settle. The lesson had gone well, but her chest felt heavy. It wasn't just Mary. More and more, she felt her students carrying weights that didn't belong on their shoulders: fear of failure, fear of the future, fear of each other. Sometimes she wanted to tell them she understood, that she too woke in the middle of the night, mind racing, heart pounding. But teachers didn't get to confess that. Teachers were supposed to be steady, the anchor in the storm. She gathered her papers, but her eyes drifted again to Mary's desk. On it, faintly etched into the wood, were 2 words scratched by a pen's tip. No escape. The words sent a chill crawling up Elena's spine. For the rest of the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was quietly unraveling. The next morning, Elena lingered near the classroom door as students filed in. She kept her eyes on Mary Reeves, who entered quietly, her notebook hugged against her chest. Mary didn't speak to anyone. She slipped into her seat by the window, as though trying to disappear into the light. Elena made a mental note. She'd seen too many students retreat behind silence until it hardened into isolation. And isolation, she knew, was a dangerous place to live too long. The lesson that day was lighter: group discussions on how music, art, or writing helped people cope with stress. Students buzzed with chatter, laughing as they shared their playlists and doodles. But Mary didn't join any group. She sat scribbling in her notebook, eyes unfocused, like someone writing from another place entirely. After class, when the others had left, Elena approached her gently. "Mary? Can I talk to you for a moment?" Mary froze, her pencil hovering above the page. Slowly, she closed the notebook and looked up. Her eyes hazel, shadowed with sleeplessness, met Elena's with quiet reluctance. "You write beautifully," Elena began, choosing her words with care. "I read your essay the other night. The part about silence and monsters, it stayed with me." A faint flush crept into Mary's cheeks. "It was just an assignment." "Maybe," Elena said softly, sitting on the edge of the desk across from her. "But sometimes the things we write say more than we mean to." "Is everything all right?" Mary hesitated. She fiddled with the corner of her notebook, nails digging into the cardboard. Her lips parted as if she might speak, but then she shook her head quickly. "I'm fine." Elena leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You don't have to be fine here. Not all the time." For a moment, something flickered in Mary's expression, relief, maybe, or fear. Then, almost in a whisper, she asked, "Do you believe people can change? Like, completely?" The question caught Elena off guard. She searched Mary's face, but the girl's eyes had dropped to the floor again, guarded. "Yes," Elena said finally. "I do. People can change for better, and sometimes, for worse. But change is always possible." Mary gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She pressed her notebook tighter against her chest. "My brother, he says people only change when they finally see the truth." "But his truth," she trailed off, biting her lip. "It scares me." The words lingered in the air like smoke. Before Elena could respond, Mary stood abruptly, murmured a quick thanks, and slipped out the door. Elena sat there long after, her heart unsettled. She thought of Jonah, Mary's brother, his quiet intensity, the simmering anger she used to glimpse in his eyes. And now Mary, speaking of truths that frightened her. That night, Elena couldn't focus on grading papers. She found herself scrolling through old yearbooks until she landed on Jonah's picture, junior year, black hair falling into his eyes, a hesitant half-smile. She stared at it, unease prickling her skin. She remembered what one teacher had said back then, "Jonah's the kind of kid who lives in his head too much. If he ever lets that darkness out, I don't know what will happen." And now, 2 years later, Elena wondered if those words had been more prophetic than anyone realized. The next few days, Elena kept a quiet watch on Mary Reeves. The girl's presence seemed to pull shadows into the room even when the sun was streaming through the windows. Mary was never disruptive, never impolite. She did her work, turned in her assignments on time, even wrote with a startling kind of insight that sometimes left Elena unsettled. But she was distant, drifting just out of reach, like a figure standing behind frosted glass. During one class discussion on resilience, students shared stories of people they admired, athletes, musicians, relatives. When it was Mary's turn, she simply said, "My brother," and nothing more. "Why him?" a boy in the back asked. Mary's jaw tightened. "Because he sees the world the way it really is. He doesn't pretend." The room fell quiet. A few students exchanged wary glances. Elena felt her chest constrict, but she forced a smile and gently redirected the conversation. Still, the words stayed with her. That evening, as she left the school, Elena noticed Mary sitting alone on the front steps. The late autumn sky was darkening, the air heavy with the smell of wet leaves. "Mary?" Elena approached slowly. "Do you need a ride home?" Mary shook her head. "I'm waiting." "For who?" Mary hesitated, then looked toward the parking lot. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My brother's coming." Elena's breath caught. She followed Mary's gaze, but the lot was nearly empty, just a few cars glinting under the streetlights. "He still picks you up?" Elena asked carefully. "Sometimes," Mary said. Her fingers twisted the strap of her backpack. "He doesn't like me taking the bus. He says there are people who watch, people who wait. He says the world's not safe anymore. There was something strange in the way she said it, half belief, half fear. Elena wanted to ask more, but just then, the roar of an engine broke the silence. A dark sedan pulled into the lot and stopped at the far end. Mary's posture stiffened. She rose quickly, almost too quickly, and clutched her bag tighter. "That's him," she murmured, and without another word, hurried down the steps. Elena stayed where she was, her breath clouding in the cool air. She couldn't see the driver clearly, the car idled in shadow, but she glimpsed a shape leaning forward, watching. Mary slipped inside, and the sedan pulled away without headlights, swallowed by the dark. A shiver ran through Elena. On the drive home, she couldn't shake the image, the way Mary's voice had changed when she spoke of her brother, the way the car had lingered just out of the light, like something that didn't want to be seen. That night, as she lay awake, Elena thought of Mary's essay again. Silence is where monsters grow. And for the first time, she wondered if one of those monsters was already standing at the school gates. The following week, the first snow of the season dusted the city in silence. St. Augustine's courtyard, usually alive with chatter and footsteps, looked muted beneath a thin white blanket. Elena stood by the window between classes, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching flakes drift lazily from the sky. She told herself the unease she'd felt since seeing Mary with Jonah's car was just overactive nerves. But the gnawing in her chest refused to quiet. At lunch, she found Mary in the library, huddled in a corner with her notebook. The other students were loud, trading jokes across tables, but Mary seemed cocooned in her own world. Elena approached carefully. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. Mary gave a faint shrug. For a few moments, Elena pretended to skim a book while sneaking glances at Mary's writing. The page was filled not with assignments but with fragments of sentences, scribbled almost feverishly. "Truth is fire. They'll never understand until it's too late. Silence is safer than speech." Elena felt her throat tighten. "Mary," she said gently, "those are heavy words. What are you writing?" Mary's eyes flicked up, sharp with guardedness. "Just thoughts. From you, or from someone else." Mary hesitated, then whispered, "Sometimes I feel like they're not mine. Sometimes they sound like him." Elena's pulse quickened. "Your brother?" Mary nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Then, as if realizing she'd said too much, she closed the notebook with a snap. Before Elena could respond, a noise interrupted them, the faint creak of the library door. Both turned. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his hood drawn low over his face. He didn't enter, just lingered there, scanning the room with a slow, deliberate gaze. Elena's breath caught. Even without seeing his full face, recognition stirred deep in her gut. The way he stood, tense but steady, the way his eyes seemed to burn beneath the shadow of the hood, Jonah Reeves. Mary froze beside her. For a moment, the room felt like a vacuum, every sound sucked away except the pounding of Elena's heart. Jonah's eyes landed on them. For a second, they lingered, dark, unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and slipped back into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him. Mary exhaled shakily, clutching her notebook tighter. Elena forced herself to steady her voice. "Does he come here often?" Mary shook her head quickly. "No. He just checks sometimes." Her voice lowered, almost reverent. "He says he has to make sure I'm safe." But there was something in her tone, not comfort, not security. Fear. Elena didn't press further, but inside, her unease sharpened into dread. Jonah wasn't just a shadow from the past. He was here. Watching. Hovering on the edges of the school like a storm cloud waiting to break. And Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Mary's scribbled words weren't just fragments of thought, they were warnings. The door clicked shut behind Jonah, leaving behind a silence so heavy that Elena swore she could hear her own pulse in her ears. The faint hum of the library lights seemed louder than before, the sound of pages turning from distant tables suddenly alien, brittle. Mary's fingers dug into the notebook on her lap until her knuckles turned white. She didn't look at Elena, didn't move, as if the act of acknowledgement might summon her brother back through the door. Elena forced herself to breathe, though each inhale scraped like ice. She had counseled students through panic attacks, through loss, through fear. She had taught them how to name their feelings, to ground themselves in the present. Yet now, her own mind betrayed her, spiraling, darting between memories of Jonah as a boy and the man who had just stood there, silent and watching. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "Mary, does anyone know he comes here? The school? The staff?" Mary's head snapped up, eyes wide. "Don't tell them," she whispered urgently. "Please. He'll get angry. He says, people don't understand him. He says they'd twist everything." Elena swallowed, torn between duty and instinct. She should report it. A man with Jonah's past reputation, loitering near the school, scaring his sister, administration had to know. But looking at Mary, she saw the fragile terror beneath her composure, and the plea carved in her eyes silenced her. Still, something inside Elena hardened. This wasn't just a protective brother checking in. Jonah had looked at her, directly at her. The weight of that stare had been deliberate, calculated. As though he wanted her to know he was there. Watching. When the dismissal bell rang, Mary gathered her things quickly. She paused at the doorway, then turned back. "He's not what you think," she said quietly. "He just sees things differently. That's all." Elena opened her mouth to respond, but the girl slipped out before she could. Left alone, Elena sat at the table, staring at the empty space where Jonah had stood. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, now cold and untouched. The image replayed in her mind, his hood drawn low, the glint of his eyes, the way he lingered without speaking. A chill crawled across her skin, deeper than fear. It was recognition. This wasn't just a man passing through. Jonah Reeves was circling the school. And Elena could no longer pretend the shadows belonged only to her imagination. The church bells rang every morning at 6, their echoes rolling through the empty streets like a call no one seemed to answer anymore. Father Michael O'Connor always heard them before the sun rose, though he rarely found comfort in their sound. At 52, his faith was not gone, but it was frayed. Worn thin at the edges like an old cassock. He had once been a man of fire and conviction, but these days, faith felt more like muscle memory, automatic, hollow, ritual without resonance. He moved through the motions each day, morning prayers, mass, confession, meetings with faculty. His voice carried authority, his sermons carried poetry. But behind closed doors, he carried silence that pressed like a stone against his chest. Guilt. It had started years ago, after a tragedy he never spoke about openly. A boy in the parish, bright and full of questions, had taken his own life. Michael had missed the signs, dismissing the boy's dark talk as teenage melancholy. The news had gutted him, left him with an unshakable sense that he had failed not only that boy, but every soul entrusted to him. Since then, every time he looked into a student's eyes, he saw shadows. He saw the possibility of despair hiding just out of sight. He prayed more fervently for them than for himself, because his own prayers felt unanswered. And then there was Jonah Reeves. Michael remembered him vividly, one of those students who lingered after Mass, asking questions that sliced too deep. If God loves everyone, why does he let the wicked win? If sin is forgiven, why should we fear hell? The boy's eyes had burned with something: intellect, yes, but also restlessness. Anger. Michael had tried to guide him, but Jonah was slippery, too quick to twist scripture into accusations, too eager to see hypocrisy in the church's walls. The last time they'd spoken, Jonah had said, "You wear a collar, but you're just another man hiding behind it. You talk about God's love, but you don't even believe it yourself." The words had struck deeper than Jonah could have known. Because Michael had feared, even then, that the boy was right. Now, 2 years later, Michael sometimes thought he saw Jonah's shadow flickering at the edge of his parish, the shape of a man standing too long across the street, a car idling with its headlights off. Perhaps it was imagination, the guilt resurrecting old ghosts. But then he would remember Jonah's intensity, the way he'd spoken of truth like a weapon. And the unease would grow sharper. On one particularly cold evening, after a long day of confession, Michael sat alone in his office with a tumbler of whiskey half empty on the desk. He told himself it was for the warmth, not the numbness. His Bible lay open, but he wasn't reading. His gaze kept drifting to the window, to the dark street outside. A faint knock interrupted the silence. "Father?" It was Mary. She stepped inside hesitantly, her notebook clutched tight against her chest. Michael sat up straighter, forcing the glass aside. "Mary, child, what is it?" She hovered at the door, chewing her lip. "Do you think people can be saved, even if they don't want to be?" The question made his heart lurch. For a moment, he thought of his own hollow prayers. Then he thought of Jonah. He rose, crossing to her. "Of course. Everyone can be saved." But Mary shook her head. Her voice dropped. "What if they think saving means destroying everything else first?" The words hit him like cold water. He studied her face, pale and guarded, and in her eyes he saw not her own fear, but the shadow of her brother's. Michael swallowed hard. His own guilt churned in his gut, heavier than before. He had failed one boy years ago. He could not, must not fail another. "Mary," he said softly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "If you're afraid, you must tell me everything." But Mary only shook her head again, clutching the notebook tighter. "I can't." He said no one would understand. And then she was gone, leaving Michael standing in the doorway, the echo of her words heavy in the air. He returned to his desk, staring at the untouched whiskey, and for the first time in years, he whispered a prayer not for forgiveness, but for clarity. Because he could no longer deny it, Jonah Reeves was back in their world. And whatever truth he believed he carried, it was dripping with danger. Father Michael sat alone long after Mary left, her words echoing in the silence. What if saving means destroying everything else first? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the crucifix on the wall. The shadows from the flickering candlelight made Christ's face look harsher than usual, as though even the carved would judge him. Jonah's voice crept back from memory, "You don't even believe it yourself." Michael pressed his hands to his eyes. He had buried that doubt under years of ritual, but Jonah's return unearthed it again. What terrified him most wasn't Jonah's anger at the world, it was how easily the boy had once seen straight through him. That night, after confession, Michael noticed a notebook left behind in the pew. Mary's. He hesitated, guilt pricking at him, before opening it. The pages were scattered with sketches, crosses, burning buildings, words scrawled in thick, uneven ink. Some were hers, but others felt like borrowed phrases, things Jonah must have whispered to her. One line chilled him most. "The world must burn before it can be clean." Michael shut the book quickly, a tremor running through his hands. This wasn't just youthful angst. These were seeds, dangerous seeds planted by Jonah. Later, walking home under the street lamps, he caught sight of a figure by the school fence. Hood up. Still as stone. Watching. His breath caught. "Jonah," he whispered. But when he blinked, the fence was empty. Only the wind moved through the trees. Michael stood there, heart pounding, feeling the familiar ache of guilt rise in his chest. He had failed before. He could not fail again. "Lord," he murmured into the night, "give me strength. I can't lose another soul." Jonah Reeves had always hated silence. Not because it was empty, but because it was full of the voices that never left him. He lay on the stained mattress in his small apartment, the blinds drawn tight. The city hummed outside, distant cars, the occasional siren, but inside, the silence was alive. His own mind never stopped whispering, never stopped replaying the past. Weak. Forgotten. They laughed at you. They left you behind. He pressed his palms to his temples, squeezing his eyes shut, but the voices bled through anyway. He remembered St. Augustine. The classrooms that smelled of chalk and old wood. The priests who preached forgiveness but lived like kings. The students who sneered when he questioned, who called him strange, broken. And Father Michael, the man who was supposed to have answers but had only given him hollow reassurances. Jonah had been searching for truth back then. Real truth. What he found instead was hypocrisy, masked with scripture. Now, years later, he told himself he finally saw the world clearly. It wasn't broken because of him, it was broken because of them. All of them. The weak, the blind, the pretenders who bowed their heads on Sunday and sharpened their knives on Monday. The voices in his head agreed. They deserve cleansing. They deserve fire. On the floor beside the mattress lay his journal, thick with scribbled manifestos. Words underlined in rage, purity, sacrifice, rebirth. Pages filled with diagrams, quotes, half-drawn maps of places that meant something to him. And always, sketches of the school. He had been circling it for weeks, watching from shadows, testing the edges. The children laughed in the yard, their teachers called them in with bells, and Jonah stood beyond the fence, unseen. He watched them the way a hawk watches rabbits. But there was one pair of eyes that unsettled him, Elena's. The counselor. She had noticed him. He could feel her suspicion, her gaze cutting through his hood. It almost thrilled him. At least someone still remembered him. Mary too. Sweet Mary, who still loved him, still carried his words like scripture in her little notebooks. She was his only tether, his only disciple. He had told her pieces of the truth, enough for her to understand that the world needed cleansing. But he also saw the fear in her eyes sometimes, the hesitation. He would fix that soon. Jonah rose from the mattress, pacing the narrow room. His hands shook as he spoke aloud, words he'd rehearsed for months. They think they're safe in their walls. They think their God will shield them. But God has no place here. Only justice. Only the truth. His reflection in the cracked mirror caught his eye. He stared at himself, sunken cheeks, hooded eyes, the gaunt outline of a man who had stopped caring about appearances. But in his gaze, he saw conviction. Fire. Purpose. And purpose, he thought, was all a man ever needed. That night, Jonah walked the perimeter of the school again. He paused at the fence, fingers curled around the cold metal. Children's drawings fluttered on the classroom windows, stick figures with halos, rainbows, crooked hearts. His lip curled. They don't even know the world they're inheriting, he muttered. But they will. Somewhere deep inside, a remnant of the boy he once was stirred, whispering of gentler days, of laughter, of Mary's hand in his when they were children. But Jonah crushed it ruthlessly. Weakness had no place in his vision. Only fire could cleanse. And he was ready to bring it. The rain came down steady that morning, streaking the classroom windows in thin silver lines. The sound filled the air, a constant hush that seemed to press on the room like a secret. Elena stood at the front, marker in hand, trying to coax her students into a group exercise on resilience. She had chosen a simple activity. Each student was to write one word on the board that described what made them feel safe. Home, one boy wrote, letters large and uneven. Mom, another added. Music, a girl whispered as she capped the marker. The board filled slowly with words, friends, prayer, books, football. But when Mary's turn came, she froze. Her hand hovered over the marker as if the question itself were a trap. Elena watched carefully. Mary's shoulders were tense, her jaw tight. Finally, she scrawled a single word in shaky letters, silence. The room went quiet. A few students giggled awkwardly, but Elena raised a hand, calming them. That's interesting, Mary, Elena said softly. Can you tell us why? Mary shook her head quickly. It's nothing. Just, silence makes me feel safe. But her voice betrayed her. It cracked slightly, like glass under pressure. Elena didn't press further, not in front of the others. But something inside her twisted. Silence, she thought. Not family. Not friends. Silence. It wasn't the answer of a girl at peace. It was the answer of someone hiding in the dark, hoping not to be found. After class, when the students rushed out into the damp corridors, Mary lingered. She gathered her books slowly, as if buying time. Elena approached her gently. "You did well today," she said. "But I'm curious. Why silence?" Mary's fingers tightened on her notebook. "It's the only time no one's judging me. No one's telling me what to believe." Her words carried weight, heavier than her voice. Elena glanced at the notebook, recognizing it as the same one Mary always clutched. She wondered if the pages inside carried the same cryptic fragments she'd glimpsed before. "Elena," Mary whispered suddenly, looking up with wide, fearful eyes, "do you ever feel like someone's watching the school?" The question sent a shiver crawling across Elena's skin. "Why do you ask?" Mary hesitated. Her lips parted, then closed again. Finally, she shook her head. "Forget it. I'll see you tomorrow." She left quickly, slipping into the hallway crowd, her notebook pressed to her chest like armor. Elena stood there for a long moment, heart heavy. She thought again of the hooded figure at the library door. Of Jonah's stare. Of Mary's trembling hand as she wrote silence. The rain outside thickened, drumming harder against the glass. And in that sound, Elena felt the warning, the cracks in the glass were spreading. Father Michael sat in his office long after dusk, the parish quiet except for the groan of the old radiator. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the windows smeared with streaks that glistened in the streetlight. On his desk lay Mary's forgotten notebook. He had tried, several times, to return it without prying further. But each time his eyes drifted back to the pages, he found himself reading more. On his desk lay Mary's forgotten notebook. He had tried, several times, to return it without prying further. But each time his eyes drifted back to the pages, he found himself reading more. I don't want to do this," Mary whispered. The other students shifted uncomfortably. Elena quickly stepped in. "That's okay. You can sit this one out." Mary returned to her seat, clutching her notebook like it was the only thing keeping her together. Elena noticed the way her eyes flicked toward the window, as if expecting to see something or someone outside. Later, when the students left for lunch, Elena lingered by Mary's desk. "You know you can always talk to me, right?" she said softly. Mary nodded, eyes down. "Even if it's about your brother?" Mary stiffened. Her knuckles whitened around the notebook. Slowly, she looked up. There was fear there, yes, but also something else. Loyalty. Love. "He's not a bad person," Mary whispered, almost defensively. "He just sees things differently. People don't understand him." Elena's chest tightened. The same words she used before. "Mary," she said carefully, "sometimes the people we love carry pain that makes them dangerous to themselves, and to others. That doesn't mean you don't love them. It just means we can't ignore the signs." Mary's eyes glistened, but she shook her head and stood abruptly. "I have to go." She hurried out, leaving Elena staring after her. Elena sat back at her desk, rubbing her temples. She thought of Father Michael's weary eyes, of the cryptic words Mary had written, of Jonah's silence in the library. The alarms in her body weren't just ringing now. They were screaming. And somewhere deep inside, she knew, this wasn't only about Mary's safety anymore. It was about everyone in these walls. She rose, crossing to the window. Outside, the schoolyard stretched quiet under a pale sky. For a moment, nothing moved. But as her eyes swept the fence line, she swore she saw the faint outline of a hooded figure standing too still, too deliberate, just beyond the trees. By the time she blinked, he was gone. Her heart pounded. Jonah Reeves wasn't circling anymore. He was closing in. Mary Reeves sat cross-legged on her bed, the notebook open in her lap, pages filled with words that weren't entirely her own. She pressed the pen to the paper but couldn't write. Her hand shook too much. She could still hear her brother's voice from the night before, low and urgent, like a secret that wrapped itself around her throat. "They'll never understand you, Mary." But you and I, we see the truth. This world is rotten. And sometimes you have to tear something down to build it new. She had nodded then, because that was what Jonah needed agreement. But afterward, lying awake, she had whispered to herself, but what if tearing it down means tearing me down too? Her brother had always been her protector. When their father left, Jonah had walked her to school every day. When classmates mocked her, Jonah had been the one to fight back. He carried her secrets when no one else listened. But this Jonah was different. His eyes burned in a way that frightened her. His words cut deeper. He didn't just talk about the world being unfair anymore, he talked about burning it clean. Mary flipped back through her notebook, tracing the jagged lines she had scribbled down in his presence: purity. Fire. They'll see. She wasn't sure anymore if writing them made her complicit, or if it was just her way of coping. At school, Elena's eyes had lingered on her, full of concern. And Father Michael, his voice had trembled when he spoke to her last week, asking if she was afraid. She wanted so badly to tell them everything. To unload the weight pressing on her chest. But she couldn't betray Jonah. He had sworn her to silence, reminding her of all the times he had stood by her. Family first, he said. It's always been us against them. Mary pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw stars. A tear slipped down her cheek, landing on the page. Because deep inside, she wasn't sure if Jonah's love was protection anymore or if it was a cage. A faint sound made her lift her head. The window. She turned, heart hammering, and there he was, Jonah, standing outside in the yard, hood drawn, face half hidden. He raised a hand in greeting, not a wave but a signal, sharp and deliberate. Her stomach knotted. She hurried to the glass, pulling the curtain halfway closed. But not before she saw it, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Jonah was preparing for something. Something final. Mary collapsed back onto the bed, clutching her notebook as if it could shield her. She wanted to scream, to run, to tell Elena, to beg Father Michael to save him. But the words Jonah had whispered the night before echoed louder than her fear. If you tell them, you're no sister of mine. She buried her face in her hands. Torn in two, trapped between love and terror, Mary knew her silence might soon cost more than she could bear. Jonah Reeves sat cross-legged on the floor of his apartment, the blinds drawn tight. Around him lay scattered papers, black marker scrawls, printouts from forums that no one in his right mind would ever visit. His duffel bag rested against the wall, half-packed, heavy already. He had been planning for weeks. Each day he told himself, one more step. One more piece of the puzzle, and they'll finally listen. They. The world that spat him out. The teachers called him troubled. The classmates who snickered when his clothes smelled of cheap detergent. The church that offered him hope only to let it rot into hollow ritual. And Father Michael, who had stood there in his collar pretending he was anything more than a weak man hiding behind faith. Jonah remembered the moment he saw through him, years ago. The doubt flickering in his eyes during confession. The lie disguised as comfort. It had been the first time Jonah realized, nobody believed what they said they did. The whole world was performing. Now, he was done watching the performance. He would bring the curtain down himself. He lifted one of the notebooks and flipped it open. Mary's handwriting threaded between his own scrawls, softer, hesitant. Her loyalty had touched him at first, proof that blood still bound them. But lately, he sensed her cracking. The way her hands shook, the way she avoided his gaze. He clenched the book in his hands. Don't you dare betray me, Mary. Still, he needed her silence. Without it, everything collapsed. Jonah stood, pacing the room. His mind ran like a furnace, heat and smoke filling every corner. He thought of the school, the clean white walls, the rows of desks, the laughter that mocked him from across the years. They would never see him as more than broken. Unless he forced them to see. In his mind, he pictured it flame licking through the hallways, screams cutting the air, the crucifix above the stage cracking in the heat. For the first time, they would know what he felt, fire eating from the inside out. But more than destruction, he craved the moment before. The silence before impact. The fear as people realized control had slipped from their hands. That, he thought, would be his true masterpiece. Jonah crossed to the duffel, pulling it open. Inside, wires coiled like snakes. He ran a hand over them, steady, almost tender. Almost ready, he whispered. Then, for a flicker of a second, a shadow crossed his certainty Mary's face, pale and trembling, her eyes wet. He shook his head hard, forcing the image away. She'll understand after. They all will. When the fire comes, they'll see it was mercy all along. Jonah zipped the bag shut. The decision was no longer abstract. The plan had teeth now, gnashing and hungry. There was no turning back. The counselor's office smelled faintly of old books and lemon cleaner. Elena sat at her desk, fingers drumming against a half-finished case note, though her mind was nowhere near the paperwork. She hadn't been sleeping well. Each night she replayed Mary's pale face, the whisper of fear in her voice, and Jonah's silent figure at the edge of the trees. Something was coming. She didn't know how she knew it, but every instinct she had honed over years working with troubled teens told her it was true. And the weight of that knowing pressed on her chest until it was hard to breathe. A knock at the door startled her. Mary stepped in, clutching her notebook against her chest like armor. "Elena. Can I sit here for a while?" Elena nodded, forcing her voice steady. "Of course." Mary perched on the chair opposite her, silent, eyes darting to the window. Elena watched her carefully. The girl's hands were trembling. "You don't look like you've slept much," Elena said gently. Mary pressed her lips together. For a moment, it looked like she might speak. But then she shook her head, pulling her notebook tighter to her chest. Elena leaned forward. "Mary, I need you to hear me. Sometimes we think staying silent protects the people we love, but silence can also destroy them. And us." Mary's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "If you're scared," Elena continued, "I promise you, you don't have to carry it alone. Not anymore." Mary's eyes filled, shimmering with tears that never quite fell. But she said nothing. Only hugged her notebook tighter and whispered, "I should go." When she left, Elena sat in silence, her heart pounding. She had been so close to breaking through. But it wasn't enough. Elena stood abruptly, pacing. She thought of Father Michael, his haunted expression when they last spoke. He knew something. She was sure of it. And his silence was feeding this fire. Enough. Elena grabbed her coat. If he wouldn't come to her, she would go to him. She had spent too long respecting boundaries, too long waiting for the right words to appear. But the alarms inside her were no longer whispers, they were blaring, deafening. If she didn't act now, she feared she'd be walking these halls one day soon over broken glass and silence, wondering if she could have stopped it. She locked her office door and strode down the hallway, her pulse quickening. Time was running out. And Elena knew whatever Jonah Reeves was planning, it was closer than anyone dared admit.